everyone. In Module 3, we're going to consider the different ways in which education research has been approached over the past century and the philosophical and theoretical undercurrents that have supported or challenged changing approaches to educational research. I want to say up front that many of the concepts in the readings and videos and the language around them may be difficult when first encountered, and there's a lot packed into this module, a lot of different new language perhaps for some of you. It certainly was for me when I first read this article. However, read and watch for a preliminary level of understanding and then return to these readings and videos later to deepen and enrich your understanding of the concepts you've been introduced to here. You can also use reputable online sources to unpack some of the language, like the Stanford Dictionary of Sociology, or the Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy, particularly the philosophy one, to help with some of the language and concepts. Because of the breadth of the content in this module, this video is longer than usual, so I'm sorry about that, but I hope it will be helpful to you in sorting through and understanding some of the key ideas and concepts that are raised by Guba and Lincoln and are picked up again in the other readings and certainly are reinforced in the videos. Before we move on, I would like to talk a bit about the assignments in Module 3. First is the discussion forum. Now, I want to say right up front that responses to your colleagues are not necessary this time, although they're certainly welcome. And you are expected, of course, to read through the responses from your colleagues, and you may want to just make even a brief response to kind of push forward the discussion, but you won't be marked on that particular aspect of the forum for this module. And the reason is that we tried to kind of cut back a little bit on the time involved for the forum while maintaining some of the important aspects of its integrity. Because the reason that we needed to do that is that this is a particularly busy module due to the annotated bibliography assignment that I'm going to talk about in a moment. More information is included in the discussion forum preamble as well. The annotated bibliography assignment is divided into two sections, and you're going to be doing the first section of this assignment in Module 3. In this first section, you're going to look for 5 articles, and only one may be from a professional journal. That means that the rest of the articles you will find will be from academic peer-reviewed sources. If you're using library search engines, they'll often provide a lot of information and tell you whether it's peer-reviewed. Not always, but often they will, so that you can make an informed judgment of the worth of that particular article to this assignment and to your work. And if you still have questions about, differentiating between a professional article and an academic article, I've put a shortish video in Module 3 that you can have a look at that will provide some of the key indicators that suggest the differences between them that you might want to think about. There are many formats for annotated bibliographies, but the one for this assignment is meant to mimic a strategy that I hope you'll find useful in your own research. That is, each annotation will provide a snapshot of one of the many articles you will inevitably explore, both in this course and in your future courses as you're moving towards your own research project. I apologize. In order for it to be useful then, you will need a complete reference to the article using APA 7th edition, a succinct idea of the key concepts in the article, including the research approach, methodology, and conclusion, and how it is linked to your area of inquiry. Now, the word to underline in there is succinct. So it needs to be a succinct, using as few but keywords as possible, so that you can go back to it, read your annotation, and find the information you need as quickly as possible. So just the key information needs to be there. The whole set of annotations are then arranged alphabetically in your assignment by author, and in total, the assignment is a maximum of 5 pages, not including the title page. It'll be double-spaced, 12-point, and so on, that will be in the assignment description. So this is a great opportunity for you to begin to explore literature around the particular area of interest you're research question that you've done the assignment for already in Module 2. That may end up being what you actually do research in your research project. So it's worth spending time looking and curating your list to reflect the best you can find related to that interest. The readings and videos are numerous. Not all of them are long. So for example, the Norman videos, although there are 5 of them, they're each very, very short, and they're all very, very worthwhile watching. They're fun, and they give you a lot of good information. The Nurse Killam video is also extremely helpful. I found that students use that a lot last year when we first introduced this. And all of these will be very helpful to you when you read Guba and Lincoln. So if you wanted to look at these first, read Guba and Lincoln, and then kind of go back to them to kind of refresh some of the concepts, that would be perhaps a good way to do it. But you know your learning style, and you can do it the way that's best for you. The Donald article is one that explores a research approach called Metasage. It's based on an Indigenous perspective, and you'll find that the interview that Dwayne Donald does, the author of the article, does with Kathy Adams, both of whom are professors at the University of Alberta, will be really helpful before you read Dwayne Donald's paper and the Ermine paper. In fact, all of these videos will be helpful for the Ermine paper. So I hope that you'll find that helpful in your own organization of your reading and watching. Egan Guba and Ivana Lincoln, the authors of the longest paper that you're going to be reading, were among the first and certainly the most well-known to challenge the dominance of positivism in education research. And by positivism, I mean a philosophical system deeply rooted in science and mathematics that is based on the view that whatever exists can be verified through experiments, observation, and mathematical logical proof. This paradigm cannot accommodate, however, other forms of knowledge. So Guba and Lincoln's challenge to positivism was deeply influential because it offered a strongly argued and philosophically informed response to the dominance of positivism and questioned its dominance and the possibilities of qualitative research. Indigenous scholars, however, didn't find a voice that was congruent with their experience of the world, and since the publication of Guba and Lincoln's influential paper, Indigenous scholars like Ermine and Donald have worked to provide an epistemology that speaks to and informs a deeper understanding of an Indigenous worldview. We're going to look briefly at both in this video, later on in the video. There are 3 concepts in particular that I would like to explore that are addressed in both papers. The first is ontology, which considers the nature of being, what things are, or the thing itself. Now, what do we mean by the thing itself or the nature of being? Well, ontology is interested in what is the essence of the thing under examination, or what is the essence of the nature of its reality. For example, we might consider an object such as a table. We can touch it, feel it, enumerate the essence of its properties, and we can be confident that those properties will not change. If we're not there, it will continue to be a table. Tables may come in many forms. It may have thick ornate legs, it may have metal legs, wide or narrow tops, made of wood or plastic or stone, and so on. But we know a table when we see it. Why? And we can identify one, and we identify one because of its essential qualities. Its essence, which in this case is physical. And I'll let you think about what that essence might be. However, the ontology of concepts such as thinking, learning, memory, love, etc., cognition, for example, are a part of the social sciences like education, but are more problematic. How do we come to an understanding of the thing itself when it's not available to us for physical examination? What is the nature of something that is more nebulous in nature? Is it knowable at all? Well, epistemology to some degree comes to the rescue when trying to answer those questions. Not entirely, but what it does is the study of the nature of knowledge itself, and it helps us to justify our belief. Justifies what we know, what we think we know about physical and social and other kind of phenomena. It's the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief in I don't know, X, Y, or Z from opinion about X, Y, or Z. In academic work, from a Western perspective, there is an emphasis on justifying a knowledge claim that we make through citing recognized experts in that field of study, whose knowledge of the phenomena is widely accepted through kind of trial and error of publication, presentations at conferences, and so on, and or providing information about the validity or trustworthiness of that knowledge claim through our own research that has been reviewed by peers, etc., in peer-reviewed journals or at conferences. In our daily lives, personal experience is an important source of data, but it may be problematic in academia if it cannot be verified through acceptable proofs. That is, information that provides acceptable confirmation that we know what we think we know, and that it's not just based on opinion. And in a day in which truthiness and alternative facts are driving policymaking and political action, we see the importance of epistemological rigor. However, we can also see that other life worlds and forms of knowledge may not find legitimacy within certain epistemological norms, and this is the issue that Ermine addresses so well. Last is methodology, which is the systematic, theoretical analysis of the methods applied to a field of study. For those of us doing research, there is a necessity to go through the process of choosing a theoretical approach for our research, and then thinking through and presenting that theoretical approach and your rationale for its choice in light of your research question. So you'll do that in written form, for example, in your research project, or you'll do that at the beginning of your thesis, etc. And then those methods are reflected in the methodology that you choose and use to rigorously explore your research question. So if I'm reviewing a PhD thesis, for example, I'm watching to see whether what a person said they were going to do, they actually did by looking at their theoretical constructs and then looking at what they actually did in their research. Do they line up with one another? And if they change, can the author justify that sufficiently? One of the key terms that Guba and Lincoln consider is the notion of paradigm. And they see it as an umbrella or overarching concept that encompasses ontology, epistemology, and methodology. For more on this concept, you can check out the starred video on paradigms in your reading and videos list on eClass. I understand a paradigm to be a distinct set of concepts and thought patterns that guides the choices we make and what is accepted as credible. In the context of research, a paradigm is highly related to the researcher's basic belief system or worldview. And we see that in the views of Guba and Lincoln, as well as Ermine and Donald. Their basic belief system and worldview guide the choices they made, guide the choices made by them because of their fundamental beliefs and values about research, about knowledge, about the phenomenon under investigation, and the ontology and epistemology from which those choices spring, the context in which it occurs, etc., and how those cultural and life world views affect how they think about those and how they justify that to themselves. A paradigm then encompasses the theories and research methods, as well as the postulates or claims made by the researcher and the standards by which the validity of that research is judged. In research, the dominant paradigm then includes the convictions and beliefs of the discipline for what constitutes acceptable research. Thomas Kuhn wrote about this phenomenon in 1962, which is probably telling because, of course, this was a time of great social unrest and great questioning of the social, political, and economic status quo. He was writing from within the context of what we might call the hard sciences, where many of the conventions were being questioned at that time as well. As he observed this phenomenon in science, he appropriated an old term, paradigm, meaning example, model, or pattern, and devised the term paradigm shift. That is, the accepted norm, model, pattern had shifted or changed. Of course, the word paradigm and paradigm shift have been taken up by popular culture, and the meaning has become somewhat obscured, but Kuhn's concept has been very important in understanding how shifts occur over time in the study and understanding of natural and social phenomena. So when he introduced the notion of a paradigm shift, he also observed that that shift does not happen in a linear or continuous way. There may be parts of the world of the academic world that accept it, while others do not, or haven't heard of it yet, or whatever. So it takes time for those conversations and questions about that new paradigm that's being offered, that paradigm shift that's being proposed, can happen. And while a paradigm shift may open up new ways of thinking about phenomena, the validity of those new ways of thinking are questioned, deeply questioned, often with great animation in the arguments being put forward. And they may be accepted or rejected by consensus over time of that particular academic community. So I'll give you an example. The Greenfield-Griffiths debate in 1974 demonstrates the ways in which a paradigm shift occurs in educational research. It also demonstrates its importance in shifting the research possibilities and enhanced understandings in the study of in this case, of educational administration and leadership. Pardon me. Tom Greenfield was a quantitative researcher. He was trained very well at the University of Alberta. He went to UBC before he moved on to OISE at the University of Toronto. And before going to OISE, he had done a great deal of teaching about positivist research. He had done lots of positivist studies, both his own research and research for boards of education and so on. His work was very influential in Canada in particular. And he studied measurable phenomena. For example, measuring the variables of principals' actions in relation to student success. He went on to OISE at the University of Toronto. And I don't know whether it happened there or when it happened exactly, but he began to be, he had also a very keen mind and was very interested in philosophy, just as something that was of interest to him. So he decided during his sabbatical that he was particularly interested in interpretivism. And during his sabbatical, he decided to go to Europe and study with some of the great scholars in interpretivist philosophy. And during that time, he began to think about how could these philosophical concepts be applied to educational administration and leadership. So, and he began to ask different kinds of questions. So rather than how can a principal do their job better so that students can learn better, he was asking questions, how might we understand the role of a principal? How might the role of power in organizations be better understood? How could, he presented all of these ideas at the international conference in Bristol, England, that was attended by Griffiths, who is a well-known American scholar in educational administration and leadership, dyed-in-the-wool positivist, whose work was firmly in that camp and he did not want to change. And when he heard Greenfield's paper, and Greenfield simply presented it as his research on what he had learned, Griffiths kind of exploded. It was a very, shall we say, lively discussion. There were many, many people there, many people who reported on the liveliness of the discussion, almost not coming to blows, but certainly lots of shouting. He didn't respond at all well to what he saw as an unwelcome paradigm shift. Greenfield, from that point on, was largely shunned by the academic world of educational administration and leadership. And his publications became few and far between because they were not his paradigm that he was seen to be championing was not acceptable within the field as yet. But he was accepted in the UK and Australia, and gradually his work began to find an audience through his students who published interpretivist work, or at least some of them did. So it was a paradigm that began to grow in terms of consciousness of others. And then there began to be very rigorous responses to this paradigm. And I've gone to some conferences where some of that discussion took place, where people tried to prove him wrong, for example, which, of course, Gooba and Lincoln suggest is impossible because we're talking about apples and oranges, essentially. But anyway, so over time, that paradigmatic shift began to be accepted. And some of the articles that he posted or that he had published demonstrated the kind of thinking that was going on. So the titles demonstrate that particularly. One was called Organizations as Social Inventions. I'm trying to think of a positivist writing a paper like that. Against Group Mind, an anarchistic theory of organization. And my favorite, The Man Who Came Back Through the Door in the Wall. His work opened up opportunities to shift the focus from a generalizable explanation supported by statistical evidence to more existential questions that help teachers and school leaders understand the social context in which they were engaged, and in so doing enabled more informed action that was particular to the context. Over time, the paradigm his work represented became more acceptable and is commonly used now in edmin and leadership scholarship. So it's not that we have to say positivism should be thrown out, interpretivism is the way to go. It's become far more complex than that. But it does take time for these new paradigms to emerge as acceptable within academia. What the Greenfield-Griffiths debate represents is a paradigmatic shift in which, until the early 1990s in education research, the predominant methodological approach was positivist, scientific, and quantitative, especially in departments of educational administration. There had been rumblings, however, in departments of curriculum studies that became more and more open to qualitative approaches to research. Edmin, however, hung tough until almost the end of the 1990s, when the paradigm shift began to occur with the work of Tom Greenfield and others, and a growing number of critical theorists in the field of edmin. And added to that became feminist theorists, anti-racist theorists, and so on. Gooba and Lincoln's work was considered revolutionary at the time. While there were people doing qualitative work, there hadn't been a rigorous philosophical examination of this shift and its worth in educational research until their work was published in 1994. And their work helped in validating new approaches to educational research, and it's still helpful. In their paper, they consider the paradigm shift from quantitative to qualitative research and the merits and challenges of each. The quantitative paradigm was dominant at the time they wrote this paper and had been for some time, as education, a relatively new field of study in academia, was fighting to prove its validity in a sea of social science disciplines where the quantitative paradigm was dominant. So faculties of education were becoming more prevalent at universities in the late 70s, and the quantitative paradigm provided stature and acceptance for researchers in education as they found their place within academia. However, as education became more solidly entrenched in academia, then scholars became more willing to open themselves to other paradigmatic approaches to educational research. Okay, I'm going to move along quickly from here and consider the outline of or skeleton of the arguments that Gooba and Lincoln present in this article, beginning with their critiques of quantitative research in education. As already mentioned, quantitative research was, and still is to a lesser degree, the dominant form of inquiry in the physical as well as the social sciences, including education, particularly in influential fields of study like educational psychology. However, as a new paradigm began to emerge, not surprisingly, critiques emerged as well. Internal critiques looked at, for example, context stripping in quantitative research and argued that context is central to many of the most important questions in education and had to be a part of any theoretical position taken by research. Otherwise, meaning and purpose was stripped away as well. Hostetler, for example, reinforces this critique when he argues that good research is research that works to improve the human condition, and those conditions are context-specific. Further, the conclusions of quantitative research were meant to be generally applicable, whereas many education issues were context-specific, and that discovery, rather than prediction, was essential in studying unpredictable environments and people in educational organizations. External critiques followed on the internal critiques. Guba and Lincoln, they argue that the theory-ladenness of facts, that is, facts are determined by the theoretical window used to view them, was an important thing to consider when you're considering the research that's being put forward. That the window only allows us to see so much. So a fact is in fact limited by the window through which you view it. Under determination of theory, or the problem that more than one window might be used to view the same facts, was important as well, particularly in thinking about something like mixed methods. But it also raised questions around how thorough the windows were that were being put forward as the only window through which to look. The value-ladenness of facts we've already talked about. The inevitable interactive nature of inquired dyad in social phenomena raises their own questions, because even if you're doing a survey where you ask questions and it's 1 to 5 or A, B, C, D, E or whatever, there's still that interactive nature of the actual interaction that's taking place between the inquirer asking the questions and the one who's responding to those questions. So that has implications for the notion of facts as well. Guba and Lincoln argue that these critiques were the tipping point. Facts seen as value-free, which is core to quantitative research, was questioned by qualitative researchers who argue that facts are socially constructed and contextually determined. That is, while it may be entirely predictable that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius in the physical sciences, the point at which, and of course that's questionable depending on context to a certain degree, that is, within our particular context, on most of Earth, water boils at 100 degrees, but that may be disproven in another context. And we'll talk about that in a moment. The point at which social phenomena occur is a different kind of fact in the social sciences. For example, we know that social environment has a great deal to do with educational success. But it's impossible to predict the degree to which that fact will become reality, if at all, in all cases. So facts within a qualitative paradigm must be examined very differently and cannot be predicted in the same way and then verified or generalized as they are in quantitative analysis. So these are things that are important to keep in mind when you're looking at quantitative and qualitative research. So here we have quantitative methods, positivism, post-positivism, and qualitative methods. And here I've only raised some. There are many more that Guba and Lincoln raise. So there's, for example, critical theory, constructivism, sometimes you call naturalism, comes out of interpretivist traditions, for example. And then between, there's quantitative and qualitative or mixed methods. So there are 4 major paradigmatic approaches to research. Positivism, that is, inquiry that relies on observation and quantifiable analysis to determine reality. And then there's post-positivism, which comes out of positivism and recognizes that truth is fallible and cannot be verified in any final sense. So in a particular context, the truth may be this, but in another context, it may be that. So in the social science, this opens up greater opportunities for more contextual analysis and for the fallibility of truth. Then in the qualitative realm, we have, for example, critical theory, which has as its goal emancipation from social norms that limit fair opportunities for all. I want to add here that postmodernism and post-structuralism may be seen as related to critical theory, but if emancipatory that is, but may arguably be seen as outside conventional theory altogether. So they're kind of in their own category. So I'm not going to deal with them here. And constructivism or naturalism comes out of interpretivist philosophical traditions that may be emancipatory, but are focused primarily on understanding what is, and in that sense are ontological. Again, check out the videos for more information. Each paradigm lends itself to particular kinds of methods that are multiple, but may be considered under the general umbrella of quantitative and qualitative methods. Since Guba and Lincoln developed this typology of paradigmatic streams, others have challenged them, including indigenous scholars who do not and do not want to fit neatly into what Donald terms colonial logics. In some ways, critical theory and forms of constructivism, such as phenomenology, come closest to what Donald and Ermine are talking about, but do not directly address cultural particularities. However, as a way of combating the determinism of colonial logics in our research and pedagogical practices, their work is very instructive in providing a glimpse into their important rethinking of dominant research norms. Pardon me. The rest of the paper goes on to explore various things. And I'm going to spend some time particularly on the implications of each paradigm's position on selected practical issues, but it looks at basic beliefs of the received and alternative paradigms, inter-paradigm analysis, and cross-paradigm analyses. And so in terms of indigenous epistemology, several of these questions are very, very important. I would say going right down to here. What's the nature of knowledge? And this is all discussed in Guba and Lincoln. How is a body of knowledge constructed? What criteria for judging goodness or quality of inquiry are appropriate? What's the role of values? What's the place of ethics? What's the place of voice? And then they go on also to talk about novice inquirers, paradigms in conflict, and which is most influential. I want to end with this quote from an Ojibwe elder and a very respected anthropologist, Basil Johnson, who is no longer with us, but whose work lives on. This quote in many ways gets to the heart of both Willie Ermine's paper on Aboriginal epistemology and Dwayne Donald's more recent paper on Métissage, in which they both explore ontology, epistemology, and methodology from an Indigenous perspective. Basil Johnson says, if the Native peoples and their heritage are to be understood, it is their beliefs, insights, concepts, ideals, values, attitudes, and codes that must be studied. And there is, I submit, no better way of gaining that understanding than by examining Native ceremonies, rituals, songs, dances, prayers, and stories. For it is in ceremony, ritual, song, dance, and prayer that the sum total of what people believe about life, being, existence, and relationships are symbolically expressed and articulated, as it is in story, fable, legend, and myth that fundamental understandings, insights, and attitudes toward life and human conduct, character, and quality in their diverse forms are embodied and passed on. In both Ermine and Donald, they reference stories, and especially in Ermine's paper, the importance of ceremony, ritual, song, dance, and prayer as core to their approach to research that is informed by and explores Indigenous ontology, epistemology, and also points to culturally appropriate methodologies. In both papers, they argue against the atomization or breaking apart of human experience and argue for an holistic approach as an ethical necessity. Several years ago, I had the great pleasure of hearing Basil Johnson speak, and he was a storyteller extraordinaire. He explained his observations of white culture like anthropologists have explained Indigenous cultures for years, as exoticized, particular, atomized, and observed from an objective distance. And for me, as a white person listening to this description or explanation of white culture, it was eye-opening to have my cultural context given back to me in an accurate and yet totally unrecognizable form. His lesson was obvious. Coming to know ourselves and others requires a different epistemology, and Ermine spells out how he understands that would look. Donald, and I would suggest watching his video before you read his paper, as I mentioned before, offers a methodology that offers not only a way to better come to an understanding of Indigenous contexts, stories, and experiences, but also a way to do so that moves away from a colonial logic by a form of researching that he calls métissage, which offers, through story located in shared place, a new way of living with one another across difference. And how important is that to reconciliation? Through these papers, we catch a glimpse of the ontological, epistemological, and methodological possibilities of Indigenous-led research that leads to good research. Research that enlightens, enriches, and builds bridges among and between communities of difference. I'll conclude here, you'll be happy to know, because I know this has gone on for a long time. And thank you for your patience in watching this longer than usual video. As always, if you have any questions about anything in this module, please let me know.